My name is Aedan Bennett. I'm a senior at Hillsborough High School, and my presentation is titled The Relationship Between Paradigms and Confirmation Bias. Today I'm presenting a real life situation from history. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution resulted in the successful removal of Shah Mohammad Pahlavi and the institution of Islamic Republic. After the revolution, there were conflicts within the government in Tehran between Ayatollah Khomeini and the more democratically minded faction led by Provisional Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan. Threat of mobilization of Soviet troops in Iran sparked fear within the United States and within the US troops and citizens in Tehran. My research question is, how do paradigms influence confirmation bias? This is related to my real life situation because US involvement in Iran as a result of imperialism and the growing tension in the Cold War create a lot of resistance within Iran to the US-backed Shah Mohammad Pahlavi. US paradigms of imperialism and Russian communism perpetrated by the media and the government during this time were reinforced by proxy wars in Latin America, Middle East, and Asia. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Americans looked to Soviet mobilization within Iran and the rest of the Middle East as confirmation of their beliefs that this was a work of communism and not the result of American imperialism. Therefore, paradigms that existed within mainstream American society during the Cold War and even today influence the way Americans confirm their knowledge. My subsidiary research question is, can paradigms change and how? When paradigms change, it's called a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts happen when a paradigm is rendered incorrect by new evidence or a new paradigm. This not only makes it extremely difficult for paradigms to change because it requires so much new evidence, but paradigm shifts are also now common because of a human tendency to look for evidence that only supports your belief. Max Planck argues that paradigms can't change within generations and can only change between generations when its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. My first claim is that confirmation bias inhibits paradigm shifts. Francis Bacon once said that the human understanding, when it has once adopted an opinion, draws all things to support and agree with it. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias. Because of the physical size and separation of the different nations and peoples on our planet, there are countless different cultures. Some have similarities to our own, but many are incomprehensible because of how foreign or how far away they are. The result of this, so we rely on the media to teach us about these cultures, and the result of this is that the media creates paradigms which they then perpetrate by a continuous cycle of relaying the same information about these cultures. This creates sort of a vicious cycle that feeds into stereotypes and paradigms. One example is the portrayal of Arabs by Western media, specifically the United States. As journalist and scholar David Lamb says, the American media's portrayal of Arabs is consistent with false and dangerous stereotypes that affect American foreign policy. These stereotypes can range from confusing Arabs and Muslims to as the same to labeling Arabs as extremists because of the actions of a few terrorists in one country. International conflicts between US and Arab nations in the Cold War, as well as the rise of Islamic fundamentalism movements in places like Egypt during the mid 20th century, sparked a lot of negative stereotypes, negative paradigms about um, Arabs and the Middle East in general. The paradigms created as a result of this media coverage were then later reinforced in 2001 with the September 11th attacks. Many Americans saw this as a confirmation of their own belief that Arabs, Middle Easterns, and Muslims were all dangerous to Western society. This culminated in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which, under the Bush and Obama administration, resulted in the death of many innocent civilians and was due to confirmation bias prohibiting Americans and American policymakers from examining the United States' role in Islamic extremism and the ignorance of the Arab citizens' role in this attack, which was none. Another similar example was the media portrayal of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The American public held very strong paradigms about the Soviet Union and communism in general, largely due to media coverage and government propaganda. Similarly, the Soviet Union, their citizens held the same paradigms about, the Western society, the USA, and capitalism. Therefore, with each proxy war and conflict that the US and the USSR were involved in, people's paradigms were confirmed. New York Times coverage of the Korean War relied on sensational language and emotional testimony to confirm the citizens and the readers' biases about the Soviet Union. My second claim is that paradigms allow for confirmation bias only in the absence of strong counter evidence. Strong paradigms often don't even allow one to consider outside evidence, but weaker paradigms can weaken confirmation bias, especially in the presence of strong counter evidence. A great example is the erosion of paradigms of US imperialism and moral superiority during the Vietnam War. The war, which lasted from 1955 to 1975 officially, is now viewed as the most divisive and controversial war in US history. It's interesting to note, however, that at the beginning of the war, public opinion was largely in support of the war. The American public supported spreading democracy to Vietnam through force as a result of the communist spread within Asia, which was a reflection of the strong paradigms of the 1950s and 1960s about democracy, communism, and capitalism. The 1968 Tet Offensive marked a shift in the war and in the values of younger Americans as protests and public opinion turned against the Johnson administration. The remarkable shift in the paradigm of US global superiority, however, was not a universal shift. The Vietnam War protests were largely youth-led, echoing Planck's assertion that younger generations are more susceptible to changing paradigms, while the older Americans still had a strong belief in the US its superiority and the military. At the same time as this, there was conflict within the United States that sparked controversy. The lasting effects of slavery, as well as Jim Crow laws and racial discrimination in the South, led to a pervasive culture of racism and discrimination in the Western, Southern, and Northern United States. In response to this, both the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Panthers were born. The leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., respectively, were very controversial. While Martin Luther King Jr. is now revered as an important hero and leader in American history, it's interesting to note that at the time of the height of the civil rights movement, he was deeply unpopular, even up until his assassination, especially among white Americans. This is an example of securely held paradigms confirming the racial biases of many Americans. Even in the face of counter evidence, Black Americans suffered racial justice and violence. My counterclaim is that emotion can override confirmation bias and help shift paradigms. Counter evidence and counter arguments that use pathos are often effective in exposing people to evidence that might contradict their beliefs. The Vietnam War protests I referenced earlier used this tactic to convince other Americans of the futility and immorality of the continued war in Vietnam. As propaganda and curated coverage of the media collapsed, the atrocities of the war were made public, the anti-war movement gained a lot of traction. Protesters began to adopt emotional appeals to win over indifferent people in their arguments. Some examples were personal testimony from soldiers returning home, images and videos from the war that showcase the horrific nature of the war. Although it is worth mentioning that these protests were largely focused on American veterans and their struggles as opposed to the Vietnamese civilians affected. This is probably because of the still nationalistic paradigms and feelings of the American people and the still negative bias against Asians confirmed by the Pacific Theater, the Korean War, the Mao Revolution, and the War in Vietnam. Referencing what I mentioned earlier in regards to the civil rights movement, it is important to mention that while white public opinion of MLK remained low until his death and even after, there were white supporters of the civil rights movement. Younger activists and progressive religious leaders joined the cause, largely due to the violence and the videos in the news that showcased the brutality the protesters endured. A big moment was the first attempted crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, also known as Bloody Sunday. The footage of the violence on that day was national news, and the emotional response led to an increase in white support. However, it could be argued that the already progressive white supporters who supported the movement silently were confirming their belief about the movement through these videos. The era I've mainly discussed here today is the Cold War era in America, which is significant for its counterculture evolution and the social and political progression of the 60s and 70s. Of course, many older Americans remained set in their American ideals, and even the weakened paradigms of American imperialism and superiority were re-strengthened in the 80s as America began to win the Cold War. I say win because that is a proper reflection of how Americans viewed the Cold War during the 80s under Reagan. Confirmation bias, in conclusion, is a major factor in maintaining paradigms. War and politics can change paradigms, but often reinforce them. Confirmation bias resulted in Americans reinforcing their paradigms of American imperialism, Arab culture, and communism after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The aftermath of a war can often lead to this justification, especially for people who seek to find evidence only to support the paradigms they believe and have always had. Thank you.